All right, thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to welcome everybody here with us today, this afternoon, this evening in Europe and in Russia. My name is Joshua Tucker. I am the director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, and on behalf of my colleague Alex Cooley, who's the director of the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, who you'll be hearing from in a moment, we're welcoming all of you to our session today on Navalny and the Kremlin, politics and protest in Russia. I don't have to tell any of you that it's been a very, very eventful last, I guess, almost 2 weeks now, but certainly last couple of weekends and then the few days before that in Russian politics. What we're bringing you today is the latest edition of, or I guess we're calling it an emergency session of, what is called the New York City Russia Public Policy Series. This is a seminar series that's jointly run by the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia and the Harriman Institute at Columbia, with generous support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And it's called the New York City Russia Public Policy Series because prior to the pandemic, we were trying to have an event for people who were in New York City to bring together scholars and practitioners to talk about important areas of public policy in Russia. But of course, since the pandemic has started, this has been open to a much broader and much more global audience. So it's great to see so many of you with us here today. We've been running about these approximately once a month, and you can find out about them at the Harriman Institute website, as well as at the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia's website. We'll put links to both of those in the chat function here of the Zoom webinar, and we'll have it as well on their YouTube page. So without further ado, it's a great pleasure to have all of you here. I'm going to pass this over to my colleague, Alex Cooley, who is going to introduce our panelists. And just to give you a heads up, we're going to do the panelists. We're going to do introductions one at a time in the efforts to keep this sort of smooth and moving forward. There will be chances for question and answer after the panelists have spoken. What we request is that you use the Q&A button, which you can find at the bottom of the Zoom button. You can also use comments on YouTube if you're watching it on YouTube to ask questions, and then Alex and I will moderate the questions once each of the speakers have gone through and given opening remarks. So thanks for being here. Over to you, Alex.
Yeah, thanks so much, Josh. And thanks again to the panelists for joining us. Each of them has made some unique and very insightful interventions on what has transpired over this remarkable last 2 weeks. So we will just go in the order of the speakers in order to save time. We will post their bios in the chat. First up is Dr. Yanagorokovskaya, who is currently a research fellow at the Institute of Modern Russia and a former postdoctoral scholar here at the Harriman Institute. So it's a real pleasure to welcome her back. She is published in a number of different outlets, had a hard-hitting piece in The Guardian on recent events. Yana, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alex and Josh, for the invitation. I'm very glad to be back at Harriman, even if it is virtual. Although there's 18 inches of snow falling in New York, so maybe it's actually better that it's virtual this time around. What I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and put the events of the last 10 days or so, 2 weeks, in a little bit of context. And I'm going to cover 3 broad themes. So one is what seems like it's new about these protests, at least what seems like it's new to me about these protests. 2, how does Navalny's plight compare to the general situation with civil society in Russia? And 3, looking forward a little bit, what is the impact of these protests on Russia's sort of political future? So to begin, start with the protests. There's protests last weekend also, and I'll leave it to the other speakers to talk maybe a little bit about protest size, protest participants, social media. I'm going to talk about the regime's response. So in general, the regime has a toolkit of protest responses, and we're really familiar with it now. It starts with denying permits for protests, so making them unsanctioned rallies. Then we have arrests of any potential protest leaders, protest organizers, preemptive arrests. Then we have pressure on teachers, employers, university instructors to discourage attendance for protests, to suggest that you may endanger your job or your university education by attending protests. Then we have using state media to spread propaganda about protests being funded by foreign powers or some kind of provocation. And then we have the very rough treatment of protesters when they're being detained. and various threats to parents for bringing their children or for allowing their children to attend protests. So those are all kind of tactics that we're familiar with. And they all happened in these two last protests. So what's new? I'd say what's new is the incredible securitization of especially Moscow and St. Petersburg that we saw this past weekend. So if you saw pictures of authorities preparing for the protests, we saw that downtown Moscow was almost completely shut down. And they shut down the subway stops, they shut down major boulevards, there were checkpoints, every couple of meters for people to pass through on foot. So this is new. I mean, so I'm not an expert on metro history, but I did see someone observe that the last time the metro in downtown Moscow was shut down was in October of 1941, when the German army was outside the city and they were contemplating flooding and blowing up the subway to abandon it, basically, so that the Germans couldn't take it. So the shutting down the metro in Moscow is a big deal. And shutting down the city in this way is also a big deal. And it suggests that for the regime, these protests are serious, that they are taking this very seriously. So I'll move on to my second point. There are some narratives around Navalny's return to Russia that suggest that this return is somehow putting him on a collision course with the Kremlin, that he is really accelerating this confrontation. But from my perspective, looking at the sort of events that have been happening in Russia over the last couple of years, it seems that the Kremlin has taken a very aggressive line towards Russia's civil society. And that trend has actually precipitated what's happened to Navalny more recently. So just a couple of examples. I'm sure most people are familiar with the Foreign Agents Law that was adopted in 2012, which has since been expanded to apply to foreign media, to individuals, and there are new draft laws that would expand it even further to apply to informal organizations, and even political candidates running for office, so that you'd have to actually wear the label of foreign agent on a ballot. People's right to assembly has also been greatly restricted over the last couple of years. So people can be charged with more crimes for participating in protests, like blocking traffic. They face more serious penalties of up to 5 years for participating in 3 unsanctioned rallies in a single year. And there are new changes that make things like single person pickets illegal. And this was one of the remaining kind of avenues for people to protest spontaneously without receiving prior permission. And then if we step back from that too, the constitutional amendments that happened last year, I think the most attention was devoted to the fact that they basically swept away presidential term limits for Putin. But what else they did was they pretty much ended judicial independence for the Supreme and Constitutional Courts, and they made it possible for Russian authorities to ignore the rulings of international courts and international treaties. And these are often tools that civil society uses to defend itself against the government. And so Navalny's poisoning, his return to Russia, his arrest, these protests should all be seen in this wider context of growing repression. So now I'll turn to my final point. Predicting the future is notoriously difficult, and political scientists shouldn't attempt it, I think. So I'll say that the only thing I know about the future is that I'm pretty sure Putin is never going to live in that seaside palace now that it's been exposed. But what can we expect from these protests? I think anytime protests break out in Russia or in other authoritarian states, there's some hope or expectation that they might lead to regime change. But the reality is that Putin's been in power for 21 years. He's withstood a number of protest waves that were very significant. He's withstood international sanctions, falling income levels. And it's absolutely true that Russians today are economically worse off than they were some time ago, especially about 10 years ago. But they are better off than they were in the 1990s, which is Putin's kind of favored point of comparison. I think Sergei Guriev recently wrote that Russian incomes are about 10% lower now than they were in 2013. The problem is that regime durability rests only partially on popular support. And you do need popular support to win elections, because you can't steal so many votes as to make it kind of implausible that you actually won. But popularity kind of matters less when you're trying to repress dissent. To repress dissent, what you really need is cohesion among the elite, and you need loyalty from the security forces. And it seems like Putin has both right now. But I'd like to end on a more positive or optimistic note. Protests that don't accomplish regime change still have long-lasting consequences. And so the protests of 2011, 2012, so almost 10 years ago, we saw produced a great number of new civil society organizations, new political forces, new electoral technologies, and all of these things are blossoming today, including Navalny's smart vote system. Navalny's own presidential campaign in 2017, 2018 that was unsuccessful grew this network of organizations across the country that are still active today. And in part, they're organizing these protests, but also really importantly, they're training and educating politically active youth all across Russia. So all of these developments are really important, and they tend to get overlooked when we're looking at, or we're hoping for kind of a quick take on protests. And I think the reality is that democratic revolutions seem sudden, but they're actually built on a foundation of incremental progress. And that's what we're seeing, and that's what we should look forward to in the future. And I'll end there. Thanks very much.
Yana, thanks so much. So our next speaker, we go to Pyotr Sauer, who's a reporter covering Russian politics and society at the Moscow Times. His coverage of the coronavirus crisis in Russia received special recognition from the American Society of Journalists and Authors. And Pyotr was kind enough to join us over the summer when we were talking about COVID in Russia. And he's been at the forefront of reporting on the protests. And we're very thankful you can make some time to join us today. Pyotr, the floor is yours.
And I hope you guys can hear me well. To start with, I'd like to sort of give some context as to where Navalny stands in the eyes of the Russians, what his popularity is, and then I would like to go into talk a little bit about my experiences of the last 2 weeks covering both protests. So obviously, there's always a lot of debate, both in Russia and outside of Russia, what Navalny stands for and what his popularity is in Russia. Some try to claim that he's more popular than Putin, while Putin himself never mentions his name, says who needs him anyway, as Putin said during his last press conference. He never names him, tries to downplay him as much as possible. The reality is very nuanced. In polls looking at Navalny as a presidential candidate, he usually ranks low. He receives, he's in the lower single digits. 2-3% of Russians say that they would like to see him as a president. But if you frame the question differently, we see different results. A very important poll has been the Levada poll in September, where Navalny received 20% approval rating. That's the highest we've seen Navalny's popularity has been. And we really see an upward trend in here. Another very interesting poll, in my opinion, that was shared with me by the Levada. Levada is a sociological center in Russia, the only independent sociological center left. Another very interesting poll was when it was asked who is the person of the year to Russians. And interesting enough, among the age group between 18 and 24, Navalny received 13% compared to Putin, who received 15%. So this is within the margin of error. So you could say for the youth, Navalny has reached the level of popularity as Putin. Navalny also ranked second in this question amongst entrepreneurs and managers. So his base is growing rather quick. And if you talk to sociologists now, they believe that these protests, the dramatic poisoning and his arrival here, have only increased his recognition and possibly increased his approval. So I think that's an interesting stuff to go into when sort of analyzing Navalny and when analyzing these protests, that his popularity is still small, but is growing and is growing rather quickly. Then the two protests that have so far been organized by Navalny supporters, they've been very different. The first one was a sort of, they were both unsanctioned, which is very important to realize. In Russia, sanctioned and unsanctioned protests have a very different character. At an unsanctioned protest, you're very likely to be arrested. There are almost no posters. The atmosphere is quite intense. It can be quite grim. There's there's no speeches. For the first protest we've seen, Reuters estimated that 40,000 people came to that protest, which is a very large number for an unsanctioned protest. Some estimate that it's the biggest unsanctioned protest in Moscow seen in 10 years. And what really, really struck my eye was the fact that protesters were actually fighting back against police. That is something that we haven't seen, that I haven't seen during the 2019 summer protests that happened because of election manipulation or perceived election manipulation in the local Duma. So what we've seen in these protests, that the protests were fighting back. They were more aggressive. You could argue more desperate for change, less scared, even though the authorities clamped down hard or even harder than in 2019. The makeup of the protesters was also slightly different than the summers of 2019. About 45 to 50% of protesters said it was their first protest. So you had a whole different crowd of people that wasn't there before, which I think is pretty significant. The big difference between the first and the protest on last Sunday was that the last Sunday's protest was more chaotic. It wasn't organized at the Pushkin Square as the previous one in the center of Moscow. This one was supposed to happen at Lubyanka in front of the FSB building, which was a very daring decision by Navalny's allies to do. It sort of became quite clear from the start that it would be very hard to organize a protest right there. The whole city was completely militarized. As Yana said, closing down the metros, it was an unprecedented step. So the protest ended up being, you could compare it to the Belarus protests in some ways. I've been to both, and what really struck me was the fact that you had clutches of people all around the city running away from police, being picked out by 1-2 people, being beaten up. We've heard of accounts all around Russia, in Vladivostok, in Kazan, in Chelyabinsk, of protesters being also tortured. There's been gas used in St. Petersburg. So we've sort of seen new elements of the protests that experts are comparing to the Belarusian style of repressions, which should worry human rights defenders. But what I think might be a consequence that the government wasn't maybe expecting or isn't happy about is that everyone here in Moscow can't ignore these protests anymore, in the sense that even those citizens that were apolitical now, their daily life has been completely changed by these protests. You couldn't walk the street without knowing what's happening because the central streets were blocked off. So this really forces people to pick a side, and it sort of becomes a daily phenomenon. And the question is, how long will this enthusiasm last among the protesters to keep this going? Tomorrow will be a huge day, of course. We will find out what will happen to Navalny. But either way, sort of this protest atmosphere that we've seen in the summer of 2019 is completely back in the picture in Moscow. So I think.
Piotr, thanks very much. Our next panelist is Dr. Gulnaz Sharafutdinova, who is a reader in Russian politics at King's College in London. And she is also author of The Red Mirror, Putin's Leadership and Russia's Insecure Identity, published recently last year. and also previous contributor to the series. So Gulnaz, welcome back. What's your take on events?
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for having me in this great discussion. I want to also reiterate Yana's points and your point, Alex, that we are in the middle of sort of a roller coaster events and a very tense moment in Russia. And of course, we all want to know what these processes mean and how close they might be to bringing change. And so let me just also share my understanding of where I see some changes and where are the continuities. And maybe while Yana focused a lot on the regime response, let me focus more on the societal level and talk more about what's new and what's the same in the society. But for the first point, let me sort of share my understanding that I think we are seeing a new political moment in Russia, which has been forced in by Navalny's decision to return and his arrest and the documentary. Someone compared Navalny's choice, and he obviously has to make a choice because the authorities didn't want him to come back. He made a choice to return, and this was a courageous action. Someone compared it how he put his head in the jaws of the lion and then started poking that lion at the same time. And indeed, the day after the arrest, when the documentary shoot out with over 100 million people watching it, and a lot of people in Russia obviously learning a lot of new things, although for many people it wasn't that new either. But anyway, it was a big slap on the face of the Kremlin's leadership, of course. So that action became a mobilizer for street protests. But at the same time, there were many structural issues that were ongoing that were leading to growing sentiments and grievances against the regime. Of course, this is the economic stagnation that we are observing from about 2013, right? Growing inequality that we have been observing for a long time. The impunity of state authorities that has been demonstrated over and over with various anti-protest activities, as well as just single arrests and things like that. And of course, the pandemic played also a big role in exacerbating the grievances among the people. But first of all, I do see a very strong moral motivation of Navalny's action and the recognition of Navalny now as, you know, a real not an alternative to Putin, but if there is anyone, then it's Navalny. I think we you know, while many people have criticized Navalny and still criticize Navalny for his past views, etc., but everyone has to now you know, agree on the point that if there is one focal point around which protest against the regime can consolidate, it is Navalny. And from that perspective, his leadership, Navalny's position in the political spectrum in Russia has, I think, acquired a qualitatively new sort of stage. And we could see this moral motivation of protest in the slogan that I'm hearing a lot in various cities in Russian. It's один за всех и все за одного, one for all and everyone for one, right? And that solidarity that we see in the protests inside Russia, outside Russia, and that solidarity in that slogan, again, that solidarity was something that I see as a reaction, you know, as just a reaction to that moral sense that is being woken up in the society. Now, starting with such a sort of optimistic view, I want to now shift to greater pessimism. The protests are not as numerous as they could be. Now, the new element that we see in the protests is that we see them beyond Russia's capital and St. Petersburg. And that has been something, you know, people going out in Kazan 2 weeks in a row, in Nizhny Novgorod, in Yekaterinburg in big numbers, in Novosibirsk in big numbers, in Vladivostok, in Krasnodar, Barnaul. I think for the 23rd of January, 170 cities were mentioned as sites of protests. I haven't seen a specific number for the 31st of January protests yet. So that's definitely something new we see. And again, this is both a reaction, as I said, to, I think, Navalny's action, but also, I think, a reflection of the mobilizational, organizational potential of Navalny's stuff around the country. It's the work that has been done before, prior to these events, and now we see this result of that work. Now, but the numbers matter, right? The numbers, I mean, the numbers we see are different depending on whether it's the official sources or Navalny's people who give larger numbers. Now, for the 23rd of January, I saw the number of around 150,000 around the country, right? But to my understanding, the protests of Sunday on 31st were smaller, and we're talking about maybe again, you know, I don't see any clear information, but the intensity, the numbers on the streets have diminished, despite the while the regime response and the preparedness and the level of repression has increased, right? So there are jokes on the media that how can you have many more detained people while the number of protesters are much lower than it was before, but the number of those who were detained and arrested and put into Avtozaks is larger. Now, from the regime's perspective, it is important, right, what numbers we have outside. And unfortunately, there, my sense is quite pessimistic from the perspective of what does it mean for you know, what signal it gives to Putin and to the Kremlin in terms of what to do with Navalny on the court hearings that we're expecting tomorrow, right? And I am a bit pessimistic about the fact that the Kremlin saw the numbers going down, despite the fact that people were out, but the numbers going down means that they believe they can crush the protest. They believe, the Kremlin believes that you know, they can manage the protests, and we will see. And that's another important point, that it's very hard to make predictions because we're in the middle of processes that are ongoing. And I think, you know, the next step is what's going to be decision in the court with regard to Navalny's freedom, and how the society will react to that decision, right? How people will react to that decision. From my perspective, the regime might be a little bit overconfident about that, their opportunity to crush the protests, even if they do not free Navalny. And that seems like one of the things that's probably is likely to happen. But again, there is uncertainty as to what's expected. Now, my last point is about big inertia in the society, right? So we do see generational split that, if I'm correct, around 70% from, at least from the polls done, from the surveys, interviews done in Moscow, about 70% of those who protest are under 35 years old, right? Which tells us about also mobilizational strategies and the role of Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook in mobilization, but also about just the, probably not, it's not a naivety, but this, you know, clean response with regard to the moral choices that people have, and how the younger are less encumbered in terms of their pragmatism, in terms of their pessimism and skepticism, in terms of their responsibilities, you know, in life. Many older people who might still, you know, might be very critical of the regime will not go out because they might be afraid of losing jobs, and, you know, but also explaining and rationalizing their choices to themselves as just being, you know, nothing will happen, you know, changes are not possible, and even if changes come, the next government will still be corrupt, etc. So that that big inertia is still there, and the Kremlin's propaganda machine is really hoping for the continuation of that inertia too. So we see generational shifts. We know where the future is going, but the present is still very much encumbered by that strong burden from the past, from the present, from the work of the propaganda machine, and from just the living conditions and problems that lead to a certain societal depression. The winter, this is my last point, when we assess the numbers being low, we need to position them in the context that this is happening actually in the context of rather depressed society, depressed by years of economic stagnation, depressed by understanding that change is difficult, that corruption is widespread, and depressed by the pandemic as well. So having all these people out also means a lot. Thank you.
Gulnaz, thanks so much. So those of you who follow our series with Josh know that we like to try and bring in experts on social media. It reflects also my colleague's groundbreaking work in his social media lab here at NYU. But I think we're also both of the mind that it's important to have rigorous social scientific analysis of social media trends and what they reveal about episodes like this. So to that end, we're really lucky today to have Dr. Alexandra Orman join us, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Communication and Media Studies at the University of Bern and Social Computing Group, University of Zurich. And she employs computational methods to examine various aspects of political communication on social media. And she's prepared a presentation for us today. Alexandra, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. And I'm going to start sharing my screen now. And I'm going to be, as I go, skipping some technical details just to keep to the time, but I'm sure that I will be able to share the slide deck later with those interested. So you should see my screen now. And I'm going to talk about the current protests on TikTok and Telegram, and I will jump right in. So first, a grain of salt. I don't have data on all TikToks posted there for various technical reasons, but I seem to have the most popular videos and a lot of them, and it seems to be capturing the general trends. So I guess the question that many have been asking in the recent weeks, ever since we saw reports on the politicization of TikTok, is, will we see a TikTok? My short answer is actually no. So what the data suggests is that what we have seen on TikTok is not a sustained mobilization or sustained politicization, but more of a short-lived hype. So we have seen that after Navalny arrived to Russia on December 17th, there was a rapid increase in the number of TikToks with hashtag Navalny and associated hashtags like posted on. It skyrocketed kind of by TikTok numbers after Navalny released the video about Putin's palace. And here you can see a graph of basically the distribution of TikToks posted every hour starting on January 18th. But here you can also see that it dropped significantly after January 23rd, so after that protest, and then it continued like dropping, and now it's quite negligible. Okay, so this mobilization was seemingly short-lived, but is this something new? So many people were discussing that we haven't really seen something like this before, and actually the answer is no, we have. It just was less in Khabarovsk, where the TikTok videos in support of Furgal, the arrested ex-governor of Khabarovsk, were posted in bulks once he was arrested. And then there was a subsequent cool down, just like we see with Navalny activity, though the activity in this case seemingly lasted a bit longer because this is a daily graph starting in July and going till now, basically. But again, we still see that it started very rapidly and there was like, this huge trend, and then it died out as it went on. And I'll mention on what I think, like the reasons behind the reasons why I think TikTok-driven mobilization is not going to be sustainable. But first, let's see what was actually happening, even if it was short-lived. So how posting activity developed here, you can see a graph again, a number of TikToks posted by hour. The blue line is Navalny hashtag, and the red line is pro-Putin hashtag or for Putin. And so, as I said, after Navalny arrived to Moscow, the number started rising, and then it started like rising even further after the release of the video with the palace. But then one day later, we see that this For Putin hashtag suddenly comes in, and I have a hunch that it's not organic, so it's paid for videos, it seems like, at least some of them. There were media reports on that, that like people are now going and buying some For Putin videos, offering money to TikTokers essentially. Also, like in my data set, I see that there are a couple of users who are posting dozens of videos with this hashtag per day, and they are like, you know, very similar videos. And these videos don't receive much engagement. So an average video for Putin receives over 60,000 views, and for Navalny, almost 500,000 views. So also, you know, there is not much motivation for an average TikToker to post videos that don't receive much engagement. So that's why I think that not all of this, at least, are organic. But also, even though after January 23rd, the activity subsided a bit, there was also a big distinction in the topics addressed by the most popular TikToks before the protests happened and as they were happening and a couple of days after. So before, the popular topics were, first of all, stuff that Navalny kind of endured from the Russian authorities, so all the numerous assaults on Navalny. Then the second one was the, I think now famous, thanks to the media, Putin Portrait Challenge, where school kids are taking down Putin's portraits in high schools and are replacing them with Navalny's portraits sometimes just taking down Putin's ones. Another one is video compilations of Navalny and Yulia Navalnaya. So the whole narrative of them being the cute, loving couple and having this amazing relationship. Another one is, of course, the palace. After the palace video was released, and there's like what I call protest starter pack. So people preparing for protests or saying that they will join the protests or what they should take with them for the protests. And then after January 23rd, this changed. And what we see is all centered on the police actions. So it's people fleeing from the police or clashes with the police, then or police violence, then clashes with the police, like this video of now arrested Said Jumayev, who was fighting the riot police in Moscow. This particular video gathered over 9 million views, and not so much of a topic because there is actually just one video like that, because that's not a common phenomenon. But the most popular video in my data set with over 10 million views as of yesterday night is how in Chita police refused to disperse the crowd, and people were thanking them for that. So yeah. But after January 23rd, the activity dropped, and could it be connected to the actions of the Russian entity that surveils the communication, so Roskomnadzor, who requested from TikTok and other social media to take down protest-related content? It's super hard to say because, again, I don't have all the TikTok videos due to technical reasons, and I'm not going to read out this whole slide, but how I can sum it up, it seems that, at least for me with my Swiss IP, most videos are accessible. Among 1,200 videos that I checked and our student assistant checked, only 100 were not accessible anymore. Again, from Switzerland, I'm not sure how it is in Russia, but 82 were actually set to private. And it seems that more popular users tend to be the ones setting their videos to private. So it might be that Roskomnadzor's actions might have led to self-censorship, among other things, and maybe the police crackdowns. But another, like, I guess, the platform itself is just not too conducive towards protest mobilization in long term. First of all, it's too algorithmic. So TikTok's recommendation algorithm decides what gets popular and what a person sees, and it's difficult to control that. There is no space for coordination and deliberation, so no group chats or anything like that. People come to TikTok for entertainment. Nobody is expecting to see the full feed of political content in long term. And videos are quite long to post because one needs to record them and acts. And the trends on TikTok tend to switch quite fast, like in general. So trends are short-lived. but we'll always have Telegram, and Telegram kind of checks all these boxes. So there is no algorithmic filtering, what gives users full control over what they see. It's already politicized. Russians are used to getting political content from Telegram. There is ample space for coordination and deliberation, and it's fast to post. And Telegram is resilient to outages, attempts to block it, and Pavel Durov won't process takedown requests from the Russian authorities, at least not on opposition-related content. So what's going on in Telegram? I'm going to jump through this super quickly. We see sharp rises in the number of views for Navalny's and Navalny's team's channels in all regions except Khabarovsk. So the bottom graph here is Khabarovsk, and this is a number of views averaged by day. And you can see that, well, basically when Furgal was arrested, the activity was much more, like there were more views for Navalny's team's channel in Khabarovsk than there are now. But everywhere else we see sharp rises, and if in Moscow and St. Petersburg these rises are comparable to the events of the summer of 2019, when we have seen previous protests in Russia, in other regions these rises are actually uncomparable. This above is Irkutsk, I think, and below is Nizhny Novgorod, but this similar pattern persists on all the other like channels that I looked at, where we see that this like rise in the number of views for these channels is unprecedented. Nothing like this happened before. Also increased view numbers on NGOs or media that cover the protests, like Overday Info or TV Rain, and the most popular posts from such media and NGOs are those that are related to the number of arrested people or to police violence. So to sum it all up, that's the last slide. So TikTok's politicization seemingly was short-lived, and the activity has been going down since January 23rd. It's difficult to say if it's because of how the platform works, or it's Roskomnadzor's actions, or police violence, or everything together. But on Telegram, we're seeing stark increases in the popularity of Navalny's team's channels, especially regional channels. It's unclear if it will be sustained though, and if there is some ceiling effect, after which it won't grow anymore. Maybe we have reached this ceiling, maybe no. And one overarching topic that attracts a lot of attention on both platforms is police violence. So I would say that mobilization potential lies, like there is a lot of mobilization potential in this specific topic, rather than just broadly corruption-centered or Navalny-centered or political prisoner-centered narratives. And that's it. Thank you.
Super. Thanks so much for that. Let's now jump right. Yep, perfect. Let's jump right now to the Q&A. We already have some questions in in the Q&A function, and I'll ask Josh to jump right in and ask the first question.
Great, and I'm gonna ask the first question, give a few people more chance to throw questions up in the Q&A, and then I'll start taking questions from the Q&A, and Alex and I go back and forth asking them. But I want to just start with one quick follow-up question to Alexandra Harriman. So thank you thanks, first of all, thanks to all the panelists. This has been fantastic already. Like, it's just incredibly useful. And I have 20 questions I want to ask myself. But Alexandra, when we talk about studying social media and politics, we always talk about social media as two things. One, it's a variable that we can put in our models, that social media may be something to be explained or that is explaining things, but it's also data in that it gives us sort of unprecedented windows into what's going on. So I was struck by your discussion of the platform affordances of Telegram and TikTok, and the sort of nature of TikTok as being this ephemeral and things come in quicker and leave quicker. And so I would, there's, a lot, I mean, when we first started getting, going back to someone who studied colored revolutions and then first kind of got exposed to social media with the Moldova Twitter revolution, right, which then ended up being much less about Twitter. But I wonder if in these particular, we always talk about the role of social media and protests. And I wonder your sense from looking at this now, and I'm happy to have anyone else jump in on this as well, is in this particular case, is social media like an important variable? Like if we want to understand why these protests are taking place, where they are, whether they will continue to take place, people's organizational efforts on social media are going to be key to this, which we do think they were, like, for example, in Euromaidan, they played an important role in organizational efforts there. Or is social media in this particular case just a useful sort of, it's like the effect of what's going on is that when there is a change in sentiment in the country, and we can see that on social media. And so we may see social media if there's less attention, like people, you know, if building off of Gulnaz's point that like if there were fewer people participating in the protests the second week, we can kind of glean that from social media, but it's not that social media is causing it. So in your sense, in this particular case, is TikTok, and I'll say Telegram as well, is it important to understand as a sort of explainer of what's driving these protests? So going back to the point that was made, I forget who made it before, maybe Piotr, that we have, or maybe it was Gulnaz, that's, you know, such a large percentage of people are new participants and are under the age of 35. Well, that would make sense. I get TikTok to look at funny videos. I see some important political stuff out there. I go join a protest for the first time. I'm more likely to do that if I'm young. All of those things kind of make sense from a TikTok perspective, from a perspective of the social media driving the protests. Or is it the alternate story here that like what's going on here is that there's a larger sort of shifts in society, and social media is just kind of a good place for us as social scientists to go to look into it and to get a sort of get a window into what's going on. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, and then anyone else who wants to jump in on that, and then we'll move to the audience questions.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's kind of a little bit of both, but I would say that it's definitely like, I'm far from this, like, you know, technology deterministic point of view that like, you know, it's TikTok or Telegram or Twitter or Facebook driving the protests. These are certainly useful tools. I would say that some are more useful than others, fortunately more useful than TikTok for coordination specifically. But we can't say, like, obviously access to information, like the way social media can kind of drive protests is through increased access to information, and also through convincing people that they are like not alone, that there is enough people who are willing to join the protests. I think TikTok in this sense, or at least like the media coverage of TikTok was quite useful, because people were reporting that the only thing that they see in their TikTok feed is now related to Navalny, which certainly gave them the feeling that kind of there is enough people, or a lot of people talking about that, and probably all of them will go to the street, or at least like, you know, a lot of them. It's not going to be like 10 supporters of Navalny. And in that sense, Telegram is also useful, because we know that you know, the freedom of speech and the freedom of media in Russia is obviously in decline, to put it that way. And Telegram in that sense gives away, and other social media obviously give a way to spread information quickly. And during the protests, it's very necessary to spread information quickly. Like what I've been noticing during this protest, as I was reading like a couple of different media outlets plus Telegram channels, that Telegram channels were normally faster, because even journalists would directly post to Telegram. And again, given the police crackdowns and how the protests take place in Russia, having fast and rapid access to information is obviously helpful. But I can't say like that, you know, social media driving protests. I think Gulnaz wants to add.
Yes, I want to jump in. I think great question, Josh. And, you know, I think it's hard not to give actually an independent variable role to social media and TikTok, specifically if we look at how effective it is in a short amount of time bring up and highlight the emotions and sentiments. So to the extent that, you know, kids and adults and whoever is going after these TikToks, you know, messages, they don't have to read, you know, you have this several seconds, but the sentiment is so clear, and it becomes an amazing mechanism for sharing and creating collective shared sentiment and emotion then is used for mobilizing. So as a coordination point, and again, as an appeal to collective emotion, how do people know that there are so many millions or 100,000s who share the same sentiments? So it's a really good mechanism and tool. And I think Navalny's team is also understanding and using it.
Yeah.
Piotr?
Yeah, I completely agree with what just Gulnaz said. And something from a more practical perspective, it's worth remembering that all the protest leaders at the moment are either in jail, under house arrest, or in hiding. Itself, Telegram played a Sunday to direct protest. A nation would announce a new place where people would gather. You'd see everyone turning phones, looking on their phones. So in that sense, Telegram is, at this point, is vital. And I was actually surprised to see that the internet wasn't completely cut off on Sunday. It was cut off last Saturday, but on this Sunday, people could freely access it. And without Telegram, they wouldn't be able to move to the prison where Navalny was staying at Matryoshka Tishna. So it's important you need Telegram when you don't actually have people leading the protest on the ground because they're gone.
Thanks so much. Yeah, those are super helpful responses. I mean, that's part of what I was trying to get at here. Also, as someone who's been, studying social media and protests for years, you always get this kind of pushback. Well, does the social media really matter? So I'm always interested to hear what other people have to say about this. And I think part of it is a very pragmatic standpoint, because if it's like social media is actually part of what's driving this, then things like takedown orders and shutting down the internet and these sorts of things have an effect. If it's just merely a window in which we can see what's going on, then those kind of measures are likely to be less effective, or even missing the point here. So thanks very much for your answers. I really appreciate it. It leads nicely into a few questions that we've gotten in the Q&A around the question of Putin's response. Right. So Piotr, you bring up the point of shutting down the internet, right? So when we think about larger questions about, this is something that I've done a lot of work on ways and tools in which authoritarian regimes can respond to online opposition, right? Shutting down the internet is a pretty drastic one, because we know, going back to, I can't remember, maybe Yana's point or Gulnaz's point about how it's impossible now, or Piotr, you made the point about how it's becoming harder and harder to not notice the protests, right? When you have people scattering all over instead of being in one square, more people see it. Well, you shut down the internet, right? Obviously, that's going to lead to lots of people realizing that something is going on. And it also causes pain to a lot of your population that may have nothing to do with the protest. So that's always considered a very, very drastic event here. But one question we got was, why do you think Putin reacted the way he did? If he would have ignored or dismissed the palace expose, everyone would have just carried on as usual. But by escalating the crackdown, Putin seems to have created a counterreaction that was completely unavoidable. Completely avoidable? Why do you think he is acting so counterintuitively? So I think with the audience, and I would like to hear a little bit more about this question of, what's going on here. And I think we in the West, we often have this in the United States, there's often this kind of Putin, the master puppeteer, who nothing he does is ever wrong. And whatever he does, it was part of a larger kind of master plan and everything like that. But a little bit more here on sort of, is the, Gulnaz, you mentioned, this is showing signs of repression here. And Yana, you brought up, what was happening here. But is this strategy likely to continue? Why do we think Putin reacted so quickly? Is this a growing sign that his back is more up against the wall? And if we had, say, Sergei Goryev and Dan Treisman here, they might be suggesting that this is the fact that they're reacting with more and more repression is a sign that traditional methods aren't working as well, or what's driving the strategy here? So Yana, I don't know, maybe if you want to take first shot at that one.
Sure. Get into Putin's mind. That's an easy one, Josh. Thanks.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things have surprised me, right? So one of the things, I think, a question that has been posed in this theme of what is Putin thinking has been, why was Navalny poisoned when he was in August? And some people have proposed that maybe it's the smart vote system. I'm more inclined to believe the Bellingcat reporting, which is that they probably tried to poison him a couple of different times, and this is the one that took. Navalny reports being sick before. His wife has reported being sick with sort of similar symptoms. And we know that Novichok kind of dosage from reporting is hard to calibrate. So I don't think that the timing itself is that significant for August. But what I'm more surprised about is the take up by Putin and those close to him of the information that was revealed in the palace video. So it is surprising that Putin felt the need to actually answer a question, in this Day of the Student interview with a university student about how this isn't his palace. He made a point of saying he hasn't seen the video, but what he's heard about it, and he can assure you that this isn't his palace. And then, they more or less kept the story alive by sending pro-regime reporters up there to demonstrate that this isn't a palace, but some like unfinished hotel. And then, and a close associate of Putin, an oligarch, then drew the short straw and actually claimed ownership of this palace. So that to me is surprising. And that actually, I think, speaks to Navalny and his team and his YouTube channel and his message penetrating society. So this seems now to be important enough that the government has to respond to it directly and not just spin a bunch of propaganda about it. I mean, obviously the response is propaganda, but so I do think, the messaging, Navalny's messaging, his anti-corruption kind of videos are having an effect on society to the degree that the regime actually wants to respond to it. To what that response will spark in society, I think that's a different question. Repression sometimes breeds moral solidarity and more people will attend protests. Sometimes it works to depress voter turnout or protest turnout. And I do think it's significant that most of Navalny's team is now in prison or on home arrest, but off social media, off the internet. And I think that will actually have an effect on protests. And I'll just leave it there.
Yep. So
do we have anyone else on that one who wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think the consensus is that the Kremlin and Putin's response have been ineffective. And indeed, they are contrary to the patterns of response to the previous films, and especially when we talk about Medvedev's 2017 house with a little ducky, which didn't get any response from the Kremlin, and there was a response in the society with protests in March 17. And my only answer is just the geometrical progression with which the documentary was watched, that it became such a big event with people logging in on YouTube and watching it, and over hours, many people reporting how many millions have watched it in the first couple of hours and in the 3 days, etc. Just the intensity of the audience, the size of the audience was so big that I think it was decided, the press services at the administration, that they have to respond somehow.
Great. So moving on from Putin, let's put the emphasis now on Navalny. We've gotten a bunch of different Navalny-related questions. Some are questioning his view, most notably about immigrants. There are some questions about his support for Crimea's annexation. Clearly, Alexei Navalny is not classically, Western liberal in a lot of his types of political viewpoints. So, I mean, that's one part that I think, Western audiences would be interested in sort of hearing about. And then the second part of that comes from a question that's asked by Cynthia Hooper, which is a good one, about what's Navalny's end game here in as far as we can see him. Is he overestimating the power of the people, or is this not about street mobilizations? Is he trying to do something else? So, Piotr, why don't we start with you, just because also coverage of Navalny, I think, is such an interesting issue, especially in the West, the way he's sort of, framed and pigeonholed. And then anyone else who wants to pick up on him can.
Yeah, we actually, in the Moscow Times, we wrote a feature today on Navalny's views and how they've developed. It is interesting how when you write about Navalny, whether you always have to sort of bring in this caveat that 10 years ago, 12 years ago, he said a lot of you could say racist, xenophobic stuff. He was actively anti-immigrant. But what's important is also to notice his political journey and his development. If you look at his platform of 2000, when he tried to run for president in 2018, you could see really that he does not really go into any of the nationalism that was so prevalent beforehand. I've talked a lot to Navalny's allies, including Sergei Guriev, Shurkov and others, they say that Navalny sort of has distanced himself from nationalism, that it's not something that's interesting to him anymore. At the same time, Navalny himself hasn't, in interviews when given a chance, he never apologized for it. He said that was his views then, without really going into more details. I think now what's interesting is to look at his current program, what he presented in 2018. It's a left, in some ways quite left program economically. He proposes a minimum wage. He's been in favor of unions, for example, as well. At the same time, his advisors, many of them are sort of open market liberals. So he's a very interesting character in that sense, because he sort of he goes both left and right wing. Some call him a populist as well, because obviously right now the big issue is the economy, is low wages. So you can't really place him in the traditional left-right way, the way we do with other politicians in Europe. I hope that sort of helped explaining a little bit where Navalny stands.
Yeah, Yana, do you want to jump in on Navalny here?
Yeah, I think that the article of the Moscow Times that summarizes Navalny's career is quite informative. People should check that out. I just add that I think there is a split, or there's a difference between the conversation that's happening in Western media, which is sort of, is Navalny Nelson Mandela, or is he a racist? That is not a conversation that is happening in Russia as much. And that's because the struggle that Navalny is in right now is not kind of a left-right kind of platform struggle, right? His main point is that corruption is a huge problem in Russia. And it is an appeal, kind of a populist appeal, to say that, corruption is a problem not because it makes a few people rich, but because it makes you poor. And so these other details, I think they are really important, and I understand why people find them interesting. And yes, indeed, he hasn't condemned the annexation of Crimea, although he has said that it was a violation of international law. He has made xenophobic and racist statements. He does advocate for border controls, a visa regime with the Central Republic countries, which Russia doesn't have at the moment. But I think that kind of sometimes when we talk about this, we look at Russia through the lens of sort of American or European political platforms. So.
Great. Josh, do you want to take it up?
Sure. So we've got a ton of questions coming in. So we're going to try to get through as many of these as we possibly can. Just to give a heads up, we've got a bunch more about TikTok. We've got some big things coming about elite level defections and regime change, which we'll get to in a bit. But I want to start with a question from Elise Giuliano, who is asking about, and just something that we haven't really touched on here right now. We've talked a lot about Putin. We've talked a lot about Navalny. Elise writes, "Great panel. The protest messages that I've seen seem highly focused on Putin. Picking up on Alexandra's last point that people may start to mobilize around the issue of police violence against protesters, has anyone observed any discourse during protests on social media blaming local authorities or blaming governors or local police with regard to any political issue? Relatedly, are the cities with harsh responses that we've seen, like St. Petersburg and Kazan, a function of where the journalists are located, or is something else happening there?" And in a sort of broader sense, if we could just dive into a little bit more on this topic of the sort of geographic dispersion of what's going on here. So is the geographic dispersion, is it the same protest taking place all over the country, really focused on the palace, really focused on Navalny, or is this like now becoming an issue where grievances or differences are different based on different places? And then, Alexandra, you also mentioned that one video, the most popular video was from Chita, right? Like, are we seeing differential responses from local authorities to these protests? And is that likely to be part of the story? So interested in anyone who wants to jump in there. Maybe Piotr, if you want to take first crack at that.
So the first question on whether we've seen different responses in different areas.
Yeah, and whether there's any sign of people blaming local authorities as well, or is this very much still a kind of nationalized protest movement on a kind of Putin versus Navalny?
No, at this point, I would say it's still quite nationalized. this is sort of what you see in the responses. But obviously, each region has its own sort of grievance. For example, in Yekaterinburg, there's been 6,000-7,000 people coming out, and amongst them has been Yevgeny Roizman, the former mayor of the city, who was quite popular, and he was sort of welcomed, and there were supporters around him, people taking pictures with him. So there's this grievance that you can't have your mayor anymore, and the people that were angry back then are sort of coming out now. What's interesting is Khabarovsk is a very interesting case example. Obviously, Khabarovsk saw massive protests over the summer because the mayor Furgal was arrested, obviously. And Khabarovsk almost saw no protests in the streets. So sort of all that anger that was there then didn't materialize in anti-Putin anger now. So sort of it's really case by case, and it's quite hard to make one generalized conclusion at this point, I would say.
Anyone else on the local dimension? Yeah, Gulnaz.
I think to respond to your first question about whether it's national or there are local, the only place where I saw the local element being discussed by observers was in St. Petersburg, trying to explain why there is such an intensity and size of protests in St. Petersburg that the disapproval and criticism of the local authorities might play a role there. But in terms of the slogans, to Elise's questions, I haven't seen any very specific, local authority motivated or directed to slogans. It's a lot on Putin. It's a lot on "we are the power," "everyone for all," "one for all, everyone for one," things like that. So as I mentioned, I think there is, first of all, of course, there is an organization and Navalny team working across the country and gathering with specific, free Navalny, anti-Putin, anti-corruption type message. But we do see a different reaction from the Siloviki as to how they manage protests. And I think the one thing that explains the difference is that in smaller cities, you have more permissive police, or at least a police that doesn't, start beating people simply because of the community and people knowing each other very closely and having to live together. While in the, bigger cities, you have the anonymity that is required for the repression to go a bit simpler. And there is one place where the protest on 31st was actually allowed officially, I think in Magadan, the one city in Russia where it was a sanctioned protest. All other places, the protests were unsanctioned. But we do see at least some differences, right, in terms of both the level of violence. In Chita, as someone mentioned already, there was no violence. So in Perim, for example, there is more allowance for peaceful protests to happen. So we do see those differences across the country.
Thanks, Piotr and Gulnaz, very much. I'm going to switch gears back now to social media. We've got a bunch more social media questions, so a few questions for Alexandra. The first one is from Eleanor Mason, is a little more on the technical side, which is that wondering again on TikTok, that you've shown this peak in videos after the 23rd. Is it possible there's a different set of hashtags that are now appearing after the 23rd? And so can this be an API type issue? And then, and I know from a little bit of dealing with, of getting some preliminary information about the TikTok API, that hashtags may not be necessarily as central to the memes as songs are and as the background music is. And so I don't know if you've been doing anything in terms of, again, following whether there are songs or background music for it and did that change after the 23rd as we moved into this period of protest? So are there potentially, I guess the question would be, are there potentially some technical reasons for seeing the drop off as opposed to people actually are less interested in using TikTok at this particular time? Then we also have and that was from Eleanor Mace, raised that issue. And then we also have a question from, I'm going to butcher this names, Weamar's Marielle. Oh, apologies for messing that up if I got it wrong. Which has to do with the extent, which says the extent of pressure from Roskomzar on the social media platforms ahead of the 23rd of January protest was unprecedented, yet still relied on the state to identify content and ask the platforms to take it down. So with the new law that came into effect on social media today, switching responsibility to the platforms to proactively identify and block content, do we think that that's going to lead to changes in what's happening on the social media platforms here? And that, I would open that up more generally to others if they have comments on that. And then the final question comes from Natalia Krapiva, who asks, do you still see, independent of this, like getting people out to the protest, do you see TikTok playing some role in Russia in terms of providing a platform for organizing targeted disruptions, with the example being what TikTokers did to the Trump rally in Tulsa? So do we see anything going on here that's beyond just the way we normally think of social media in terms of providing inspiration or information about protests to these kind of targeted TikTok activities? And I guess I'll just throw in, right, is there a possibility that we see K-pop fans getting involved, right, in Russian protests as well, and some other, other things of those kind of TikTok-y type natures of social media and protests? So I threw a ton out there for you, but jump in wherever you want.
Yeah, okay, I will start with the first technical question. Yeah, I'm also tracking a number of hashtags and a number of music clips, but I thought that my slide deck was already barely fitting into 10 minutes. So I put only the Navalny hashtag. Now we also see the deckline on the others. There was a bit of a less of the deckline on the meeting or rally in English hashtag, but it's difficult to disentangle that one without qualitative analysis, because people in Belarus also use that one, and some of them are of these hashtags are from previous videos related to Khabarovsk, and people and some of the pro-Putin accounts also use that one. So that's why I explicitly relied on Navalny here, because this was easier to kind of disentangle from the noise in the data. In terms of the sounds, yes, the sounds are used. I'm also looking at the sounds, but again, this need to be analyzed in context with qualitative analysis, because sometimes the same sounds are used in non-political contexts. So again, with change of sounds ahead of the protest, for example, there were a couple of songs that were used on a lot of protest videos. What I found interesting was that a lot of people use, if you have seen this video of Navalny and his wife boarding the plane, where Yulia Navalny takes off her mask and says this famous quote from the Brother 2 movie, hey, dude, bring us some vodka, we are flying home, in my, translation. I don't know how it's properly translated. This one was super popular as a background sound, sometimes mixed with some music ahead of the protests. And after the protests, in all of this, police violence and people fleeing from the police, it's obviously the 90s or early 2000s famous Russian music group Tattoo, T-A-T-U, with the song They Won't Catch Us, or for the Russian speakers, Nas ne dogonyat, which is also used in other contexts. So it takes if there is no decline in activity, I can't disentangle without looking through dozens of TikToks, whether it's still everything political or not. That's why. And in terms of targeted actions, I actually think that TikTok might be good for targeted actions, true, like what we have seen with the Trump rally, but not for sustained mobilization, as I said, because the trends shift quickly. But for quick targeted actions, I think we might see something like that in the future, not just in Russia, but beyond. And what was the final question about the Roskomnadzor, right? About the platform responsibility. I think it's super interesting. I wouldn't predict much here because, well, so I guess TikTok will actively bow to the Russian authorities because TikTok is a Chinese company, largely. I'm not completely sure with Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as a subsidiary of Google, because these are American companies, and I guess, like, my hunch would be that the executives, if it comes to it, will have to assess the cost and benefit of paying these enormous fines in Russia versus will it lead to a massive public outcry in the West, largely. And with Telegram, I don't see Pavel Durov bowing to Russian authorities anytime soon, basically. So I guess there it won't affect much. There was like this very interesting case, if you have seen like there are a couple of Telegram channels that are collecting personal data of police involved in, allegedly involved in the beatings or arrests of protesters, both in Belarus and in Russia. And these Telegram channels exist, they are not blocked, and even though they publish personal data. But once, right after, I think the 23rd, the Telegram channel appeared that collected personal data of people who were fighting the police or who participated in the protests. It was very swiftly taken down by the Telegram team. And I guess this is ideological moderation. Yeah. And that's why I also don't see Telegram bowing to the Russian authorities anytime soon.
Well, Naz, you want to quickly weigh in?
Yes, I wanted to add 2 points about TikTok from my observations before January 23rd. I was, I saw talking about the musical background, a lot of kids using the song of this singer Face with specific place which says, being critical of authorities doesn't mean being critical of a motherland. And this message, I think, is really important because it goes exactly against the Kremlin's messaging that patriotism and love for Putin is one. Right, so the TikTok messaging now seems to have sort of broken up that Kremlin's message. The second point we have not discussed, and I think is worth of considering, is the role of social influencers and how they are also in some ways pressured to take political positions. And we do know that on Instagram and TikTok, the biggest social influencers have been apolitical. We have seen politicization of people like Yuri Dudz and things like that. But now with, you seem to have a cultural sphere and the singers and rappers and hip hop and all those guys, but also famous bloggers actually trying to take a position, and the role of social influencers on social media in these political events, I think, is turning into something also an interesting happening as of now.
Thank you. We just can't get through all the questions, but there's so many good ones. So I want to switch now to the question of this anti-corruption narrative, anti-corruption activism. So Maria Rahova asked, does the anti-corruption narrative have the power to create a cross-sectional, cross-generational coalition in Russian society? Could it accumulate and combine existing political grievances, or would it have to formulate new issues? And then right after that, Harley Balser reminds us Navalny's video was about a lot more than the palace. Is Putin trying to dodge the far broader indictment by letting Rottenberg claim ownership? Doesn't that point to precisely what the video is trying to demonstrate? So Yana, let's go to you first. What do you think about anti-corruption as a mobilizing issue and about some of the dynamics of the video and its fallout?
Yeah, so I mean, to think back to the protests, I didn't, in my comments, my original comments, I didn't really want to kind of talk about the history of protests in Russia, but I think, sometimes we lose a little bit of perspective by looking at each individual instance of protests. But corruption has been a big theme in protests in Russia, not only to do with Navalny, organized by Navalny. The protest reforms protests around the pension reforms of 2018 were, I think, indicative of how galvanizing the issue of corruption is, because here you had, for people who are unfamiliar, Putin is reelected in March of 2018 to the presidency. Navalny is excluded from the ballot because of this conviction that he has in the Yves Rochard case. And then almost immediately, Putin announces that the pension system is in need of reform, which it is and was. And they announced that they will raise the retirement age. And one of the kind of problems there is that the retirement age for men, also the new retirement age for men, also coincides with men's life expectancy. So essentially, people then talk about how you will work until you die, and then you don't need a pension anyway. And protests erupt very quickly afterwards. There's also the World Cup going on at that time, but protests start happening, and the message in the protests, and we see actually a really big coalition across generations and across occupations and across political views of people who come out to protest against the pension reform. And the claim that they're making is that they don't trust the government. to do the reform in a way that will actually be beneficial to people. They say, you're going to make us work longer and you're going to steal the money anyway. And Putin, again, we forget about this, but in an unprecedented event, Putin actually comes out and goes on television in August of 2018 to defend the reforms. And he rolls back the retirement age from the proposals, right? They're still raised, but he rolls back the age and he defends publicly the reform. He takes ownership of it. And then we see in the regional elections that happened in September of that same year that the first time ever, 3 or 4 governors from United Russia actually lose elections, including in Khabarovsk, which is where Sergei Furgal is elected and who was removed in July of 2020, and where we see those protests. So I think that anti-corruption is in fact a really powerful message in Russia that has the potential to build coalitions. The degree to which it has the power to kind of maintain protests over time, I think is difficult to judge. Again, the protests of 2017, 2018 died out. But we did see them have political effects, especially in the regional elections. And so the question, I think, for the authorities and for protest organizers is how much of what's happening now will affect the September 2020 or September 2021 Duma elections, right? The state Duma elections that are scheduled for September of this year. United Russia's popularity is at 30%, so they're going to need all the help they can get. And this corruption message has the potential to motivate a protest vote. I'll stop there.
Yeah, can I just quickly add?
Yeah,
I think I agree with Yana. The corruption can be sort of a unitizing topic, but I don't believe that Navalny will be that person to lead that movement across ages, because his popularity and approval among older people is just very, very low. There's several reasons. Most notably is the TV importance for the older generation, and Navalny's name has been completely destroyed on state propaganda, so on state TV. So I don't believe that Navalny will be able to majorly change the way the older population looks at him in the nearby future, because the numbers have been stagnant. They're not going up, his popularity ratings. So in that sense, corruption can play a role, but will Navalny lead that movement across ages and social classes? I'm not sure.
Okay, so go on. All right, go ahead.
I wanted to bring a bit of point of disagreement and to suggest that actually Navalny has been criticized for only pushing corruption message, and that the more resonant message would be the issue of social justice and inequality, and that corruption becomes important in that frame of social injustice and inequality in Russia, which really resonates really well, while perceptions of corruption as a systemic problem that's not going to go away is one of those big frames that many people in Russia do share, that do not believe that it is possible to bring in new state officials who will be non-corrupt. So that pessimism with regard to the systemic nature of corruption actually undermines the mobilizational potential of the corruption messaging. So I think it's important to keep that in mind and compare with other potential. And Navalny has understood that very well, and he has been moving in the direction of pointing out the injustices and inequality.
Yeah, that has been his move afterwards, and his program as well, proposing minimum wage, unitizing, proposing unions. So he's been sensitive to that, to move away from just the corruption message, as Gulnaz said. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. All right, so we're rapidly running out of time. We've got a little bit more than 5 minutes left at this hour. Thanks to all of you who've stuck with us this far. I think for the final question, we said we weren't going to ask you to predict the future, and we're trying to do more of analysis of what we've seen already, but we do have a lot of questions sort of on this kind of larger regime level and larger societal level questions moving forward. So I'm going to try to bundle 4 of these together and give each of you a minute to respond. And if there's something else you wanted to say, that's fine. And don't feel compelled to respond to all of them together. But here are a bunch of different questions. So from Stephen Wilson has asked, are we, as a good comparativist would, are we beginning to see any signs of elite level defection, right? Yana, you had mentioned that, you need elite cohesion for repression. How close do we think we are to seeing potentially elite defection? Joshua Rubinstein brings up this idea that people have started talking about, are we entering a period of Brezhnev again, where kind of nothing's happening, old elites, economic stagnation? Are we in the sort of period of Brezhnev, or is this different? And then two questions from anonymous attendees. One asking the question of a sense of how much polarization there is on this issue. Like, we've been mainly talking about society from the point of view of the protesters, but are there sort of passionate feelings on the side of society that are opposed to the protesters that see this as causing problems? And to the extent that, is this sort of a global, is Russia part of this, becoming part of this global phenomenon of increased political polarization? And then finally, a last question from an anonymous attendee about sort of drawing the contrast and comparison to the momentum we seem to see around protests in Belarus. Now, maybe it's too early to answer that question in Russia, but if there already was a drop off from week 1 to week 2, although we don't know what the difference in the weather was, as I watched this blizzard in New York City here between week 1 and week 2 in most of these places. But, do we see a Belarusian path forward for Russia, and potentially why not, if it's already sort of doesn't look like it's going to be there? So a lot of big systemic level questions. Feel free to jump into any of them. And why don't we go, just to wrap up, we'll go in the order that we did at the beginning here. So Yana, do you want to kick off the discussion and ask everyone to take about a minute to ruminate on some of this?
Yeah, so have we seen elite defection? So to go back to a previous question, this question about the palace video being more than just about the palace, and that's absolutely correct. The palace video was interesting not only because it gave you this like really cool 3D go inside of Putin's palace and see the the hookah lounge with a stripper pole kind of thing. What was interesting about it is that it laid out exactly how Putin and those close to him were able to amass a fortune, and his sort of from his days in Dresden in East Germany and all the way through his time in the St. Petersburg government, and then his move to Moscow and his rise to the federal government. And the Novani team has said that they had that information for quite a long time, but it was really, really boring. So, this paper trail was really boring, and then they got these blueprints to the palace, and they were able to sort of put it together in a much more kind of appealing video. So what I think is interesting about that part of the video is that it highlights not only Putin, but some of his, say, 10, 12, 15 closest associates. And it really puts them in the spotlight. And it's not things we don't know necessarily about them, but it does put them in the spotlight, and it asks them, or it shifts the risk over to them, or it shifts attention over to them. And we've already seen, the ownership of the palace expressed publicly. We saw Putin talk about a couple of other people publicly that he admires and that he works with, and that, maybe he has a retirement plan to work with them. So far, I don't see a lot of elite defection, and I don't see kind of the pressure on the elite to abandon Putin, right? I mean, things might change, but it seems like they're more in the spotlight now, but that hasn't caused them to kind of move away from him. In terms of
off, because we're almost out of time.
Sure. Yeah, that's fine.
I'll be quick about the elites. I think very important to see what will happen if the West actually sanctions those that Navalny wants to see sanctions, and these aren't the Siloviki or St. Petersburg friends of Putin, but Abramovich and Usmanov and other oligarchs. And the question is, if they will get sanctions, whether that will only bring them closer to Putin or push them away from Putin when they realize that their personal finances are in danger. That's a question we don't know yet, but I think it's very important to look at. Quick question about polarization. I don't think Russia hasn't reached or never had the levels of political activity we see in the West, where in Trump's America, families couldn't sit at the same table. Russians have traditionally been quite apolitical. It's a society that never really had that much agency. But you see politics is becoming a much bigger part of daily discourse, whether it's Instagrammers, musicians, artists, everyone sort of speaking out. It's cool now to speak out. And with speaking out, you take a position. So I foresee that there will be more discussions, more fights as well. But society is sort of waking up to political reality, I would say. That's for me.
Piotr, thanks so much. Gulnaz.
Very quickly, although observers are talking about Putin becoming a liability from being an asset, we haven't yet seen elite defections, although we do see Vexelberg discussing how many milliard, 1.5 billion being frozen in the accounts. So we do see that, but we haven't seen yet elite defection. On the social political polarization, that's a very good question, and that's very important to talk about, because I think it is happening. And despite the fact that, you know, the social media and, you know, the future belongs to the younger generations, we do have about 52% of the population that trusts TV, and the propaganda on TV does frame protests in very dangerous terms as mobs, as bringing in the reality of Ukraine that is very much feared, and the animosity and sort of the Kremlin propaganda is directing the grievances and the hatreds and the anger towards the people who are on the streets. And I don't know numbers for sure, but I'd say anywhere between a fifth to fourth of the population probably is sharing and listening closely to what Kisilyov and Solovyov and their framing does resonate.
Great. Alexander?
Yeah, I guess I will address the Belarus related question then. I guess the difference right now is also that the protests were triggered by two very different political events of very different magnitude. So Belarusians have seen, like, what they perceive at least as elections stolen from them, presidential elections. In Russia, what happened now, like over the past 2 weeks, it was like basically Navalny initiated event. So Navalny coming back to Russia and being arrested, like he probably expected that, and Navalny and his team releasing the video. If like in a month we would have presidential elections coming up, and I don't know, let's say Navalny's wife would be allowed to run, and then Russians would perceive that she actually won, and in the end, like she got only 10-20% officially, I guess we would see much larger protests. So I would expect larger protests to happen in September after Duma election, depending on how that goes. But yeah, that's a prediction.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you all for this and for coming at short notice, sharing your insights, your research, your expertise. Thank you, audience, for sticking with us throughout your lunchtime and well beyond. And let me just mention, you can check both the calendars of the Harriman Institute and the Jordan Center for different events. Our next joint event in this series will be March 8th, possibly something on vaccine politics. Thanks again, and we shall see you very soon. And thank you as well to Josh and all the staff who make this happen behind the scenes, Sasha and Carly as well. Bye, everyone.